In late 2025, a team of researchers in China put more than 100 college students into an MRI machine, all of them regular short video users, and looked directly at the physical structure of their brains. What they found didn't match the panic. It didn't match the reassurance either. According to that study out of Tianjin Normal University, heavier short video users actually showed increased gray matter volume in two specific regions, the orbitofrontal cortex and the cerebellum, areas tied to reward processing and emotional regulation. Not shrinkage, growth. That single result should have complicated the entire brain rot conversation overnight. It barely made a ripple outside a handful of science outlets. Meanwhile, Oxford University Press had already named brain rot its official word of the year for 2024, after more than 37,000 public votes, citing a 230% surge in how often the term was being used. 2 data points. One says your brain might be changing in ways that look like growth. One says an entire generation is naming their own decline in real time. Almost nobody is holding both of those facts at once, and that gap is exactly where this video lives. What's coming in the next 20 minutes will change how you think about every hour you've ever spent scrolling. So, if that's useful to you, subscribe now because we're about to walk through what the actual research says, not what the panic headlines claim it says. But to make sense of a contradiction like that, brain changes that look like growth, alongside a term the internet chose specifically to describe decline, you first have to understand what researchers have actually been measuring. Now, recently, most of this data even started to exist, because the outcome only makes sense once you understand the setup. So here's where we're going. We're going to trace where the phrase brain rot actually came from, and why it's older than the internet by more than a century and a half. Then we're going to walk through what attention span researchers have actually measured happening to focus in real numbers over the last 2 decades. After that, we're going to get into the brain scan studies, the ones showing measurable structural change, because that's where the story stops being vibes and starts being biology. Then comes the reversal, the part almost no video on this topic gets right. And by the end, you'll know exactly which parts of brain rot are backed by real evidence, and which parts are just a very old anxiety wearing a very new word. Let's start with the word itself, because it's older than you think. And knowing that changes how seriously you should take the modern panic. According to Oxford University Press's own announcement, the first recorded use of brain rot wasn't on TikTok. It was in 1854 in Henry David Thoreau's book, Walden. Thoreau, writing about his experiment in simple living, criticized a society that reached for simple ideas over difficult ones, asking why, if England was working to cure the disease killing its potatoes, nobody was working just as hard to cure the brain rot spreading through everyday thinking. That's not a coincidence worth glossing over. It means the fear that we're collectively getting dumber, lazier, more addicted to easy stimulation is not a new fear invented by smartphones. It's a fear that shows up almost every time a society gets a powerful new way to consume information quickly. Oxford's own selection committee noted the term picked up new life specifically because of Gen Z and Gen Alpha communities who started using brain rot about themselves, often jokingly, to describe long stretches of low-effort scrolling. Caspar Grathwohl, president of Oxford Languages, called that self-aware usage somewhat cheeky, pointing out that the generations creating the content are the same ones naming its effects on themselves. That's an important detail, because self-deprecating slang and a clinical diagnosis are not automatically the same thing, and a huge amount of coverage since 2024 has quietly treated them as if they were. Here's the checkpoint. Before we go further, pause for a second and ask yourself, when you use the phrase brain rot about your own scrolling, do you actually mean something has measurably changed in your brain? Or do you mean something closer to, I wasted an hour and I feel a little guilty about it? Hold that answer, because the research draws a real line between those two things. Most casual conversation doesn't. Now to the part that isn't slang, attention span research, which has been tracked for over 2 decades using real behavioral measurement, not vibes. According to Gloria Mark, an attention researcher at UC Irvine who has studied this for years, the average amount of time people spend focused on a single screen before switching away has fallen from about 2.5 minutes in 2004 to roughly 47 seconds today, with a median closer to 40 seconds. 2 independent replications of that measurement, cited alongside her work, landed at 44 and 50 seconds respectively. Close enough to the original number that this isn't a one-off statistical fluke. That's a real tracked decline sustained over 20 years. And how long the average person's attention holds on one thing before jumping to the next. And it's not purely something platforms are doing to you. Mark's research also found that user-driven switching, you choosing to tab away, choosing to check another app, now roughly matches platform-driven interruption, which complicates any story that puts all the blame on the algorithm and none of it on habit. layer in the usage numbers, and the picture sharpens. According to Pew Research Center's 2024 data, about 57% of American teenagers visit TikTok daily, and 16% describe themselves as on the platform almost constantly. And this is where an operational detail becomes genuinely unsettling. Reporting on TikTok's own internal research has described a specific habit formation threshold, around 260 videos watched, or roughly 35 minutes of continuous scrolling, after which usage patterns start to shift toward compulsive rather than intentional. That's not a rumor about the algorithm being evil. That's the platform's own internal research, describing in specific numbers the point where a session stops being a choice and starts being a habit loop. That habit formation number raised a stranger question, though, because a platform understanding its own compulsion mechanics is one thing. Proving that compulsion actually damages the brain physically is a completely different and much higher bar. And that's exactly the bar the next wave of research tried to clear. We break down stories like this every week before they turn into oversimplified headlines. Subscribe if you want the fuller picture before it gets flattened into a hot take. This is where the evidence gets genuinely serious, and where most brain rot content online stops doing its homework. A large-scale review pulling together data from 98,299 participants across 70 separate studies, the most cited reference on this exact question as of this spring, found that increased use of short-form video was associated with worse cognitive performance, specifically in attention span and impulse control, along with higher rates of depression, anxiety, stress, and loneliness. A separate review of 14 additional studies reached a similar conclusion. Heavier short video use tracked with shorter attention spans and worse academic performance. And in 2025, a study published in the journal Translational Psychiatry found that more screen use was associated with reduced cortical thickness in brain regions, tied to memory and higher level decision making. Layer in the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, a long-running U.S. research project tracking thousands of children over years, not weeks, and neuroscientist Torkel Klingberg's team found that high social media use, roughly 2 hours or more per day, was linked to slightly slowed development of the cerebellum in the brain scans they reviewed. Klingberg himself called the effect small, but noted the trend was moving in one direction and said that if it continued, it would eventually matter. And here's a detail almost no one puts front and center because it complicates the all screens are the enemy narrative. In that same research, video games were the one screen activity that did not show this negative association with brain development. Klingberg's own earlier work has actually pointed the other way, suggesting certain video games can support cognitive skills rather than erode them. That single fact should reframe how you think about screen time as a single category. The evidence isn't condemning all screens equally. It's converging again and again on one specific pattern: fast, fragmented, algorithm-driven short-form content, consumed for hours at a stretch. You'd expect all of this to add up to one conclusion: that short-form scrolling is straightforwardly rotting a generation's brains. Full stop, case closed. For months, that's the version of this story that dominated headlines and comment sections alike. But here's where it gets stranger, because the actual researchers behind these studies are far more careful than the headlines built on top of them. Nearly every one of these findings is correlational, not causal, meaning the studies show that heavy short-form use and cognitive difficulty tend to show up in the same people, not that scrolling definitively causes the decline, as opposed to, say, kids already struggling with attention or mood being more drawn to easy, fast content in the first place. The ABCD study is one of the few tracking the same people over time, rather than comparing different people at a single moment. And even there, researchers led by Jason Nagata found that kids and teens with disordered patterns of phone and social media use were more likely, 1 year later, to experience depression, attention issues, and sleep problems, according to their report published in February in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. That's stronger evidence than a single snapshot survey. But more likely, 1 year later is still a world away from scrolling gave you brain rot as a settled medical fact. And remember that MRI study we opened with, the one showing increased gray matter in the orbitofrontal cortex and cerebellum among heavy, short video users. Researchers don't fully agree yet on whether that kind of change reflects the brain adapting in a healthy way to a new kind of stimulus, or reflects a stress response to overstimulation. Some readings of more gray matter sound reassuring, others don't. The honest answer right now is that nobody has definitively settled which one it is. You now see where the word actually came from. A 19th century complaint about lazy thinking, not a smartphone-era invention. You now see what's actually been measured. A real, sustained drop in sustained attention over 20 years, alongside associations with anxiety, mood, and sleep that show up again and again across tens of thousands of participants. And you now see the honest limit of that evidence. Correlational in almost every case, genuinely causal in only a handful of longer studies, and complicated by at least one brain scan finding that doesn't fit the doom narrative at all. This isn't a story where the internet is innocent, and it isn't a story where you're already cognitively ruined because you watched 4 hours of short videos last weekend. It's a story where the honest answer sits in the uncomfortable middle. Real signal, real noise, and a research field still catching up to a behavior that barely existed a decade ago. If this helped you separate the real research from the panic headlines, it genuinely helps more people see the full picture instead of just the scary half of it. Comment which part surprised you most. The MRI study showing brain growth instead of decline, the 260 video habit threshold, or the finding that video games didn't show the same negative effect as short-form video. Send this to the person in your life who keeps joking about their own brain rot. They'll actually know what the evidence says by the end of it. I went even deeper on how the recommendation algorithms behind these platforms are actually built to hit that habit formation threshold, and it connects directly to what we just covered. Watch that next.